Alrighty. So I know that there has been several different approaches to analysis of this novel, but the one that I found is that um, there's an alternative way to look at the story, given what we've learned about sexuality and gender. This read of Frankenstein pays special attention to bigenderism in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, particularly using a genderqueer lens to understand the struggle and actions of Victor, the protagonist. So I'm just going to give a brief history of the period that the novel was written, in which it takes place, novel background, including themes and Shelley's process, and then analysis of the novel's protagonist, Victor, regarding independence, childbirth, and marriage. The Regency era was a dichotomous time spanning from 1811 to 1820. It was a time of great wealth and devastating poverty, kindness, and hostility. In particular, American ambassador Richard Rush once wrote that there was ignorance and crime so widely diffused as to appall, and yet so much genuine learning and virtue. The notions of binaries permeated every aspect of English culture, affecting the values and beliefs of its people. People then, as many do now, believe that God created a binary world, good and evil, rich and poor, men and women, where destinies have been predetermined by an almighty creator to fall under one category or the other. Regency era was a period where men were men, women were women, and both were expected to abide by strict binary gendered practices set in place by the government and influenced by the church. The novel in particular, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is a Gothic novel that contains numerous binary themes: human and creature, living and deceased, natural and unnatural. What it does lack, though, is a clear moral champion, nor does it have a clear antagonist, as its protagonist, Victor, fluctuates between hero and villain throughout. And that's not the only binary that Victor drifts between. He also bears male and female attributes. He embodies what it means to be queer in a socially oppressive state. Victor's experimentations, while on the surface appears an attempt to play God, are alternatively a desperate attempt to seize power of existence and to achieve individual freedom. His rejection of a strict gender binary is evident in his depiction, actions, and desires throughout the novel. Shelley, who began reading at a young age, was exposed to the early Gothic before writing her own romantic Gothic novel. Fred Botting writes that the romantic Gothic depicts evil as tyranny, corruption, and prejudice, identifying with certain, often aristocratic figures, and more frequently with institutions of power manifested in government hierarchies, social norms, and superstition. So the regulations of the church and states spread fear, hegemonizing members of the LGBT community. Shelley wrote in the introduction of the 1831 re-release of the book, "What terrified me will terrify others." So being queer in Regency England was something to fear, and evidence of Victor's queerness rests in the subtext, as she does not explicitly state it. So she uses an epistolary framing device, and this explains why Victor would naturally remain silent on queer matters, as he confesses the events of his life to a stranger. A lack of candor on his part protects him from persecution. Gothic heroines in particular explored anxieties concerning marriage, childbirth, and independence, or their lack of, through the supernatural. By genre standards, Victor personifies the Gothic heroine. He contends with these issues of independence, childbirth, and marriage in a unique way. Additionally, Gothic heroines are passive protagonists, preserving their virtue when defeating the immoral male villain of the story. Victor is, by and large, a passive protagonist, which will be mentioned throughout. Victor stands at the precipice of acceptance. He is not bisex female and not by psychological constitution male. He falls somewhere in the middle. On the issue of independence, the laws of primogeniture often dictated that the firstborn sons of upper-class landowning families, known as the landed gentry, inherited their father's property upon his death. So Victor, as the eldest son, would benefit. His parents oppress upon him their desire for him to marry by gifting him a fiancée as a child. In marriage, he would need to produce a son so that the family's estate be bequeathed to another Frankenstein. However, Victor does not express interest in such a cushy future. This is the first instance of passivity. In his childhood, Victor's mother plucks an orphan out of her home and gifts her to Victor. He grows up with his intended, Elizabeth, calling her cousin, but he never expresses excitement or joy over their engagement, just supine acceptance. Nor is he motivated to take marriage vows until the last volume of the novel. I'll get into that more later. Victor says, quote, "I believed myself destined for some great enterprise. The worth of my nature supported me when others would have been oppressed, for I deemed it criminal to throw away in useless grief those talents that might be useful to my fellow creatures." So someone as well educated as Victor would likely be familiar with the notion of a third gender. The era was entertaining the notion of queer. Historian Ian Mortimer writes, transvestitism and gender identity issues were beginning to be noticeable, as was the question of whether it was morally right to hang men for homosexual acts. Anne Lister, an independent gentlewoman of the period, seen here wearing men's fashion in a portrait by Joshua Horner, took a remarkable amount of lovers in her life. She did not entirely avoid negative attention, but she did not encounter anyone who would damage her respectability and social standing. She could be open with her sexuality in a way that men could not. A whiff of homophobia and a man could be executed on an accusation alone. And with the thinking of the time, risk eternal damnation. And Lister isn't the first or only person to normalize queerness. Though few have tried, did not carry enough influence to motivate change. Discriminatory voices were, unfortunately, the louder ones. Victor, reflecting on the events of the novel, declares, "It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their persecution, happiness their disregard. He could live his life happily as queer as long as no one knew about." Stemming further back, history teaches us Vigas possessed the capability to write one's own fate and change it, rendering mortals virtually powerless. The people of Mesopotamia believed in Inanna, also known as Ishtar, a deity who could change a person's gender. Victor demonstrates a modicum of hope. If he could attain the power of a god, like someone such as maybe a Christian god or as Inanna, he could become the paragon of change. And it's through science that Victor finds a sense of power in a world that takes great lengths to control others. He had a desire to learn the secrets of heaven and earth and the mysterious soul of man, wishing to understand the origins of things, thus approaching repression with a problem-solving attitude. His discovery of galvanism gives him the means and the inspiration for creating the creature. Victor struggled emotionally and psychologically in his youth. Quote, "My temper was sometimes violent and my passion vehement, but by some law in my temperament, they were turned not towards childish pursuits, but an eager desire to learn and not to learn all things indiscriminately." So it's this hope that this thirst for knowledge is born. It's in his studies and in his schoolmate Henry that he begins to feel contentment, even happiness. He devotes himself entirely to the study of science rather quickly. Natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor these works so full of genius and discrimination, which modern inquirers have written on the subject. Victor lacks confidence in himself, which overshadows his optimism. Quote, "Nothing is so painful to the human mind as great and sudden change. His rejection of his own creation is born from an inability to accept change. So while the creature's appearance is a revelation to the reader, to Victor, it is not." When he sees when we see the creature through his eyes for the first time, he writes, "His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips." So the horror that overwhelms Victor in this moment derives from his success. Feeling for the first time the weight of his actions, it dawns on Victor that it would be impossible for the creature to acclimate into society. In the creature, Victor witnesses the physical manifestation of his queerness, thereby rejecting him and thus causing him to flee his creation. In the wake of his abandonment, Victor dreams of Elizabeth. I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, he says. They became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. His horrific vision stems from the terror of having violated social norms. Victor is bedridden for a period, nursed back to health by his best friend Henry. Shelley uses symbolism to portray Victor as a mother rather than as a father. While bringing the creature to life, he usurps the woman's role in the reproductive process. People knew little of sexual reproduction in the Georgian period. It was believed that men provided the seed to women who were, in essence, incubators, having no concept of a human egg. Victor attempts to replicate a natural, quote, process, taking the product of man and ushering it into the world. Additionally, the moon, thought to have an effect on women's cycles, appeared as a symbol in Gothic texts and appears in this section of the novel. Following his birth, the creature recalls the moon had disappeared from the night. Shelley uses the absence of the moon to symbolize Victor's abandonment. Despite all odds, though, the creature survives and comes to desire a companion, one he demands Victor creates. In Shelley's time, abortion was commonly known as an act to be performed on women only. Under duress, Victor prepares a female companion for the creature, but before he can bring her to life, he destroys it, effectually having an abortion. The reason for which is stemmed in Victor's own difficulty in reconciling his queerness. They might even hate each other. The creature who had already lived loathed his own deformity. This is Victor projecting on the creature. Though Victor speaks of the creature, he also speaks of himself, referring to his initial rejection of his firstborn. Victor's next act of passivity occurs when the creature murders Victor's younger brother. Although Victor does not know for certain it was the creature, he believes it firmly. Family friend Justine Moritz is framed for the murder and later executed. Victor does nothing to offer aid that could exonerate her. He watches as she is tried and punished for a crime that she did not convict. And eventually Justine just accepts that this is her fate. So he not only just is the cause of the destruction of her body, but also of her mind. Finally, the last issue of this discussion regards Victor's marriage. In his third act of passivity, Victor sits on his engagement, avoiding taking any action to progress his relationship with Elizabeth. He's only engaged because his mother arranged the union, and Victor finally marries Elizabeth when his closest companion, Henry, dies. There's a stark contrast between how Victor speaks of his intended versus his best friend. Victor's thoughts often end on Henry. Even when speaking of Elizabeth, Victor's mind inevitably drifts to the one who is not his betrothed. Victor admires Henry for his knightly characteristics and relies on him as a partner does, to be by their side in sickness and in health, share in laughter and sorrow. In describing Elizabeth, Victor says she was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, and that she busied herself with the following aerial creations of poets and the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home. However, when he's describing Henry, he exclaims, he was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs and began to write many a tale of enchantment and knightly adventures. So Henry personifies the archetypal love interest in a Gothic text, someone who is of high moral character, who is knightly, who is there to rescue and tend to the weak, often weak and ailing female protagonist. Victor expresses a deep attachment to his friend than his fiance, an idea that is not entirely lost on Elizabeth, who, quote, I could not quit Henry for a moment. In a letter to Victor written after Henry's death at the hands of the creature, Elizabeth asked, do you not love another? Victor experiences a violent physical reaction to the loss of Henry, whereas upon discovering Elizabeth's body, he processes the loss with a sense of acceptance and defeat. And similarly can be said of losing his mother, young brother, and Justine. And losing Henry, Victor recalls, how can I describe my sensations onto beholding it? I feel yet parched with horror, nor can I reflect on that terrible moment without shattering in agony. The examination, the presence of the magistrate and witnesses passed like a dream from my memory when I saw the lifeless form of Henry Clairvaux stretched before me. I gasped for breath, and throwing myself on the body, I exclaimed, "Have my murderous machinations deprived you also, my dearest Henry, of life?" Victor was carried out of the room in convulsions. The body gives weight under him. Grief takes over his body. A fever follows, and Victor's bedridden for 2 months, verging on death. This turning point prompts suicidal ideations. First, he wonders why he did not die, and then he follows the path of what he believes is certain death when the creature threatens to be with Victor on his wedding night. However, Victor is mistaken. Some readers have interpreted Victor's marriage as a disregard for Elizabeth's well-being. However, it can also be taken as Victor is setting himself up to be murdered. Victor doesn't simply think about Elizabeth at all in this scenario. It's not so much that he condemns her, but saves himself, or at least he believes it. In marrying Elizabeth, he bows to social pressure. Victor embraces his role as a heterosexual male in this thinly veiled attempt to atone for earlier transgressions. Wedding and bedding a woman is the pinnacle of heteronormativity at the time. Regardless of intention, though, the creature murders Elizabeth. Victor describes the events as, quote, I escaped from them to the room where lay the body of Elizabeth, my love, my wife, so lately living, so dear, so worthy. She had been moved from the posture in which I had first beheld her, and now as she lay, her head upon her arm and a handkerchief thrown across her face and neck, I might have supposed her asleep. I rushed towards her, embraced her with ardor, but the deadly languor and coldness of her limbs told me that what I now held in my arms had ceased to be Elizabeth, whom I had loved and cherished. If Victor were in love with Henry, it would be devastating to marry another or to witness Henry do the same, thus further driving Victor to change his fate. But because Victor loses what is likely his love, he resigns and finally marries Elizabeth. Shelley wanted to write a story that, quote, would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature, and she accomplished that. She warns the reader through Victor the dangers of fearing our own happiness, our own identity. Frankenstein argues that we should choose our own destinies and not allow our fates to be ruled by others. Had Victor embraced his creation, had he embraced himself, the grim events that unfold throughout the novel could have been avoided. For better or for worse, we are the architects of our own fates. Thank you.